Joining me today is someone who probably needs very little introduction, but I will do a little bit anyway. Michael Rosen, as you probably know, is a children's author and poet who has written more than 140 books. I can't be more precise than that. He's also a broadcaster and political columnist. He's a former children's laureate and has won more awards than I think we have time to name. Most recently, he has written this book, The Missing, the true story of my family in World War II, which is very much on the topic that we're here to discuss about his sort of discovery of his own family history as a third generation, I think, is that right? And also a book of poetry, on the move poems about migration. It is worth saying from the outset, both of these will be available for your purchase during the break, and I think Michael will be signing some of them. I should also say this is the second time in 2 days that it's been my task to interview or question someone who has formerly been a guest on Desert Island Discs, which is incredibly intimidating. I wish we could talk more about some of your favorite albums and songs, but unfortunately that won't be today's task. But please join me in welcoming Michael Rosen. So, Michael, there's so much we could discuss. I think that having read The Missing, it's worth just touching on your family story. It's worth touching on you and how you discovered it. It's worth touching on your choice of what to do with that information once you've discovered it, and then maybe a bit about how that has had an effect on you, an impact on you. And for those of you who may not have had a chance yet to read The Missing, it is just hot off the presses. It really looks at your quest, I suppose, to learn more, particularly about two of your great uncles, Oscar or Yeshi and Martin. And I was particularly struck in the earlier chapters of the book how you talk about your own family life at home, your upbringing, and how it wasn't something that was very commonly discussed in your household. Your father was quite casual in sort of mentioning things about death camps and things like that. There's actually a particular and very short passage that I earmarked that I thought was quite poignant. When you talk about learning about the fate of your relatives, you wrote, "And now they were gone. No way of finding out anything at all about them. They had just disappeared. We didn't even have any pictures of them. All that was left was my dad's shrug." Can you talk a little bit more about your household and how this was sort of in the air but not ever discussed?
Yes, so my parents, I always knew, they're both Jewish. They were often speaking in Yiddish, often referred to things in Yiddish. I think the very first word I knew for belly button was pipig. It took me some time to discover that I had a belly button. And my parents used words that I thought were English. I didn't know. The drying up cloth was never called a drying up cloth. It was always a schmutter. I only ever found out it was a drying up cloth when I went to school. Came home and said, "The guys at school call it a drying up cloth, Mum." And she said, "No, it's a schmutter." She was very helpful like that. She walked into my bedroom that I shared with my brother and said, "This place is a Mishnah-monk." I said, "What's a Mishnah-monk?" And she said, "Well, this place." And walked out. She said, you know, one thing you don't want to be, Michael, is a shloch. I said, "What's a shloch?" She said, "The one thing you don't want to be." So, I sort of figured it out. There was this stuff going on that belonged to my parents. And more than that, they talked about things. Today was October the 4th. October the 4th is the 85th anniversary of the Battle of Cable Street, when the East End community stood up against Oswald Mosley, who was attempting to invade the East End of London. And it was the fact they stood up for it, and my parents, it was their first date. They didn't quite express it like that, but they were 17 and they were there on that day. And so all this went into kind of tea times and meal times and holidays and so on. But what you've just touched on is that my father would occasionally refer to the fact that he had two French uncles And then we'd say, well, where are they? Because we used to go on holiday to France. We went on camping holidays in France. And they would say, well, where are they? And he'd say, well, they were there at the beginning of the war and they weren't there at the end. And if you're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, so people in the room, you'll know this better than me, but it's mysterious, and also you try to read your parents' faces when they say these things. And so the shrug that you've just referred to, my father had a way that when things distressed him, he would look away and his face used to sink. I just got this sense of his cheeks kind of falling slightly and saying, well, they were there at the beginning of the war, they weren't there at the end of it. And then you'd say, well, what happened to him? And what happened to them? And he'd say, well, they probably died in the camps. Well, this is the 1950s, and the phrase, the camps, it had very little meaning. I mean, as it happens, I'm really not being frivolous here, is that we went on camping holidays. So when my father said the camps, I sort of envisaged a campsite. I mean, it's awful, I know, I'm not saying that to make a joke, but as a child, that's all I kind of tried to figure out. But there were clues that emerged over the years. So when I was 11, we went to Germany. We stayed in Weimar. My parents were on some kind of teacher's delegation. And on one occasion, my mum said, we're going out this afternoon to a place that you can't come. And she said it's called Buchenwald. And it didn't have any meaning to me at all, but when she came back, and my parents, both of them, but I can remember my mum in particular, being utterly changed physically and visually. My mother had quite dark skin, and if she was in distress, there would be like dark patches under her eyes. And I remember as a child, I was 10 or 11, looking at her and thinking, what's happened? And she said there was this terrible place, and all I could think of when she started talking about terrible things were done to Jews and to people, the only thing I could think of as a child was of the torture room at the Tower of London. That was the worst thing I knew about, was the torture room at the Tower of London. So there's my 10-year-old's knowledge, circa 1956, 57, what all this stuff was about. That's how limited some of us were. And I don't think my parents tried to hide things from me. It was the way they talked about it and what they thought was appropriate. I should say, they didn't ever mention that my mum lost a child between me and my brother. So this idea of what you talk about and what you don't talk about, even with quite open parents like mine, it's a complicated matter. So clearly they couldn't talk about this stuff, didn't know actually what went on. And then one other thing I'd mention is that I went to a wedding, my cousin's wedding, when I was a teenager, and this was the first time I met my father's cousin Michael. So the Mishpucha, as she was called, the wider family in Yiddish, as with all families, there were people you saw, people you didn't see, people you were broigus with. So that means, for those of you who don't know, broigus with means that not talking sort of thing. But anyway, so Michael was at the wedding, and then it was explained to me that his parents had put him on a train in West Poland, and that he had gone to East Poland and had never seen his parents again, and that he had been recruited into the Anders Free Army, the Polish Free Army, which was what the Poles set up once Russia, after Operation Barbarossa, had invaded eastern Poland. And he had fought in the Polish Free Army, had gone right the way around the edge of Europe, had gone from Russia into Iran, towards Palestine, and then had fought in this terrible battle, the Battle of Monte Cassino, which he had survived. And I'm jumping ahead, I've only just recently pieced together that he was actually brought to Britain as part of the arrangement between Churchill and the Poles to a Polish resettlement camp. So the Poles, Jews and Poles, non-Jewish Poles that is, in the Polish Free Army were brought to Britain and put in Polish resettlement camps all over Britain, some of them staying till as late as 1950 and 51. He got out by about 1948. They weren't badly treated, but they were held in these camps because there was a whole row about what their status was. And he was released from this Polish resettlement camp, arrived at my aunt's door, knocked on the door, said, Lady Sylvia. It was he only had 2 addresses in the world, as far as I understand. The French relatives, who we know have gone. He had his Polish background, but he knew that both his parents and all the people in his family, the Rosen and the Rechnik families, had been killed in the Holocaust. He knew that, but he had arrived at my father's sister's house, his Lady Sylvia, and he trained to be a cabbie and died earlier this year at the age of 97, speaking in 3 languages last time I met him, Polish, English and Yiddish. And so this awareness existed, so going back just to that wedding, that was made clear to me. So there was a chunk of the family, the Polish part of the mishpucha, who had also been killed in this thing, the Holocaust. And then, being someone who went to school and obviously at college and reading stuff, I got to know what the Holocaust was, but there's this big question mark. Where were the French guys? And I speak French, and read French. So I thought I must try and find out. So that's the quest that you referred to. I'm sorry if my intro's been a bit long.
No, not at all. It's fascinating. Yesterday we had an all-online day of the conference, and we heard several different speakers who were 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation even, talking about what it is that they knew, what it is that they had to come to learn. And yours is interesting because you sort of talk about how it was out there but not out there, and then it was really only as an adult that you then needed to go do the proper research, and you had the skills and the ability to do that. So what was it that finally compelled you to go to the Wiener Library and the other institutions that you went to and actually dig in?
Why could Hitler get away with it? So how come that the Nazis, had committed this incredible, foul, terrible acts of genocide, the Holocaust, however you add it up? How had he managed to do that, but also how they managed to conceal so much? So it was the fact of the Holocaust, or the facts, plural, of the Holocaust, but also how it was concealed, and that enraged me. That in my own family, that this was invisible, that somehow or other all I knew about these 2 uncles was their probable names, Oscar and Martin, their possible places of where they lived in eastern France, and names like Nancy and Metz, Strasbourg were mentioned in the family, and there was an oral memory of what their jobs were, it was thought that one of them was a dentist, and the other one was either a watchmaker, clock mender, but somehow in that. And that was all that we had, all that was in the oral memory of the family. If I can just give you just a picture for a moment of the generation, you said the 3rd generation. So the Rosens, that's to say my father's father, that generation, in other words my grandfather's generation, you've got to picture them spread out across America, France, and Poland. That's the grandfather's generation, yeah? And obviously you add in England with me, because my dad came back from America, as it were, as a child, so he's a migrant from America, my dad. But as far as the Holocaust is concerned, you've got to think of, in terms of that generation, of people in Poland, 4 in Poland, 2 in France, 2 in America. So part of my quest was to go to America to find out what the Americans knew. So that if I could just put that in your mind, that image. So, and it enraged me that there was no information, and Michael Rechnik didn't know, because that's the cousin at the wedding, because he didn't know what had happened to the French relatives either.
You talk about feeling that sense of being enraged. I mean, you are, prior to having written about your own family background, you've written quite a bit about refugees. You're known as a political thinker and commentator. Was there some component of it where, you finally realized that some of these broad topics that you had been concerned about for a long time actually had a personal connection to you? Or was it the case that somewhere beneath the surface you always sensed that there was a personal element to the issues that you were concerned about societally and politically, and that that this was finally connecting the dots from the personal to the artistic or whatever?
Hard for me to answer it because it feels mixed. So it feels that that my concern about it was very, very personal. Why should there be this hole in the family? And then it was this real, I'd been involved in producing a leaflet, a pamphlet about Holocaust denial that was endorsed by David Cesarani and Rabbi Hugo Grin and others. At the time that Irving, this was before the Irving libel case and all the rest of it, and I remember thinking, well, where did these relatives fit in? And it just, I can say, there was this personal annoyance and irritation and anger that somehow or other is just this blank. It's very difficult to describe. Maybe people in the room have experienced the same thing. Why can't I find out about my uncle? Why can't I find out about my aunt, my Zayda, my Baba, or whoever it is? And it's very frustrating, but also, of course, as the various waves of stuff about refugees and about migrants have come up, and the whole issue of it, and Jonathan spoke very movingly about the Windrush generation, but thinking back to when all this began, for me there were other talks about it. When I read about the Avion Conference, I don't know whether people know about that, but you read about the Avion Conference that took place before the war, where all the great powers sat down and said, what shall we do about the oncoming problems, or however they want to call it, or the Jewish question. I'm saying that with big inverted commas, I promise you, Judenfrage, all right, but as the way they used to put it. My dad said, Jewish question, who's asking? So, that was there as well. How it intermingles in my mind, it's unplatted, it's braided, as you might say. And so I can't fully sort that out in my own mind, but certainly agitated in general about it all.
Okay, I might want to touch on that a little bit later, because I'm fascinated by that, the connection there. But I wanted to ask you about, you talk about as you're doing the research, and it's a years long process of discuss, sort of active, going to archives and finding things, and then things coming to you almost by accident or by chance. You talk about, learning information about people and then feeling the sense of, desperation or hopelessness about the thing that you knew was going to happen to them, that they didn't yet know, which is really, really compelling and moving as I was reading it, the sense that, it's already happened, but it's only being revealed to you now. Can you just talk about the emotional component of going on this sort of journey?
Yes, so basically I got nowhere. So I knew these towns, I would try and find out, were there any Rosens in Metz and Nancy and so on, and I wasn't getting anywhere. I got hold of the complete book of the deportations from France of all the Jews that was put together by the wonderful Serge Klaasveld, Beate Klaasveld in France. So I don't know, very briefly, if you know the story in France, is there were probably about 250,000 Jews in France at the beginning of the war. Some 77,000 were killed, and most of the 77,000 were deported, and most of them were foreign-born Jews, so-called, inverted commas around that. Not all, but mostly were. And I have the complete list of them, and of course I would comb through it regularly for Jews called Rosen, Jews born in Metz or Nancy or whatever, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And then one of those things that maybe rings a bell with many of you, something very fortuitous, some extraordinary coincidence happened. Various people died at the American end of the Mishpucha, and 4 letters turned up, saved by somebody who was married to somebody and so on, a far distant, not even a relative. And these 4 letters were utterly overwhelming. There were 2, not from Eastern France, but from Western France, from Oscar. And he's calling for help to the American relatives. And then the other 2 came from Stella, which is the mother of this chap, Michael, that was at the wedding, Michael Rechnik, and 2 were from Poland. And they're all asking for help from the American relatives, from my grandfather's brother. So that's Max and Morris, who are in America. And these had survived in the family. Now suddenly I had an address and I had a place, Niort in Western France. I don't know whether you know it, it's in the Département de Sèvres. And now I suddenly started researching. So the first thing I did was go online, and I found a book called Les Chemins de la Honte, which means the paths of shame, and it's the history of the persecution of Jews in Deux-Sèvres from 1940 to 44. And this book arrived in the house on the day I was moving, so it's quite poignant in a way. And my wife was saying, we need to get the stuff in the car, and I was kind of saying, I've just got this book. She said, Michael, we've got to get in the car, or we're not going to get to the new house. I said, no, but I got this book. She said, I know you've got a book, you've always got a book. And I said, hang on a minute, I'm just going to look in the back of the book. And she said, yeah, you're going to look for Rosen. Yeah, I said, and look, I'm looking. And it was horrifying in a way, because under Rosen, there are a set of references. Normally I'm excited by references to Rosen in the back of books, but this was horrifying, and here is a set of them. And I then flicked back to the first one, and there was the same address that was on the letter, 11 Rue Mélèze, Niort, though the name was different, it was Yeshi, but I can come back to that. All right, and then on I went through the book. You can see my post-it stuck in the book, and there discovered that Oscar was married to Rachel, which I didn't know, that yes, he was a clockmaker, horloger de carillon in French, which means a clockmaker of chiming clocks, actually, carillon, and that indeed he had died, he had been killed in Auschwitz, that he went on convoy 62, so these convoys are all listed out of Paris, mostly out of Paris, and that he had escaped from Niort, but also that of course he had been issued with the Étoile Jaune, the Yellow Star, that he had had his business taken away from him and had become a market trader, the bonneterie as it's called in French, so they must have just given him schmatters to sell, or he must have just become basically a beggar, him and Rachel, and that he'd have to put on his stall entreprise juive, Jewish business. So the labelling had gone on, but he had escaped, he had become a clandestine, he had escaped somehow, the pair of them, and so I had a mystery. They'd escaped but had been deported, and so the next phase, because I went on searching, was to discover incredibly that their names had appeared. I was looking through, in fact, your fraternal organisation, Association of Refugees in France, and suddenly up came a monument, what they call in France a stèle, a monument in the city of Sedan for the victims of Nazi barbarism. And on this monument are the names Oscar and Rachel Rosen, and it's in the town of Sedan in eastern France. So suddenly I did some more research and discovered that in actual fact they had escaped to Nice. Why Nice? Because Nice, incredibly, Jews were being protected in Nice by the Italians. This is not a bit of history that's well known, but the Italians invaded southeastern France, and when Eichmann, and it was Eichmann, demanded that the Vichy government hand over Jews, and demanded of Mussolini that the Jews in Nice should be handed over, the Italians, for reasons nobody quite knows, didn't. And so Jews were fleeing to Nice and the Alpes-Maritimes, that whole area around there, in the hope that they would be saved from the Holocaust that they thought was coming. In fact, they referred to the Eastern Territories, they created a nonsense word, pichipoi. All they knew at this point, 1941-42, was that people were disappearing to the east and not coming back, but nobody knew why or how. The information hadn't come in yet. And so they referred to it as pichipoi, and they were safe from pichipoi in Nice and Alpes-Maritimes. And so my great-uncle and aunt were there in the hotels had been requisitioned because they were empty, there was no tourist season. And a benefactor, philanthropist, by the name of Angelo Donati, had proposed that he had requisitioned, what he had done was requisition 4 boats, and this is after the Battle of El Alamein that had liberated North Africa, to enable Jews to escape from this area to North Africa. So Jews were waiting in the hotels. At this very point, the Allies defeated Italy. And at that point, Donati pleaded with Eisenhower to not announce the armistice between Italy and the Allies. But sadly, Eisenhower did, at which point the Nazis marched into Nice and the Alpes-Maritimes area And of course Jews were waiting in the hotels, Hotel Excelsior, Hotel Judith and others, and basically rounded them up and shipped them out, as confirmed, on Convoy 62 to Auschwitz. And so that's how I found out the fate of Oscar and Rachel. And if I'm jumping ahead now, these convoys, there are commemorations at the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris every 5 years or so, and I was very glad to be able to go to the commemoration and read out their names. A very, very moving ceremony. See their names engraved on the wall, because all this had existed in the archives. That Oscar, Yeshi, Rosen, and Rachel Rosen, Rosen, was engraved on the wall, on the wall of names that exists in Paris. If ever you're in Paris, please do go. It's a very moving place. And so I was able to make that connection. I haven't been to Sedan to see the stele, to put a stone on that. But again, leaping ahead, no, we'll come to Martin in a minute. Sorry, yes, I'll stop it.
Well, I actually was going to change focus, but I mean, feel free to take these questions whichever direction you think appropriate. This whole genre of writing is one that is personally appeals to me. My family story is sort of broadly similar to yours. Haven't done nearly as much research into it as you have, but as many of us, I suppose, we sort of catch that bug at some point or another. I'm thinking of works like The Lost by Daniel Mendelsohn or House of Glass by Happy Friedman that look not just at the family history, but of that thing that I said earlier, of the quest. And this is quite a niche kind of story to tell. And the thing that differentiates yours, of course, is that it is written for children. Why were you confident? I mean, I suppose if it was going to be done well in anyone's hands, it would be yours as a very experienced children's author and poet. But why were you confident that this particular type of story could be told to younger audiences? Because it's not an obvious one.
Okay, as I'd been discovering this material, discovering what had happened to my family, various people were asking me to come into schools and talk about it. So Professor Helen Weinstein in Cambridge, who's part of History Works, has been asking me to do preparation for Holocaust Memorial Day ceremonies and working with Cambridge children. And I know Cambridge you think of as perhaps, the university and somehow very posh, but believe you me, it isn't like that. So I was working in all sorts of areas in Cambridge and talking about it. There were other people of refugee backgrounds from Rwanda and others talking about it, working with children, doing poetry, dance, drama, music, and so on. And so I was, if you like, finding a voice with which I could tell this story. But then also I'd been into a sixth form college in Newham and had spoken about this, and a young man put his hand up and said, yeah, but none of this happened, did it? And I didn't know what to say at first, and I couldn't say anything, and I was upset. I'm upset now just thinking about it. That I'd pieced together all this stuff, that I'd done all this, I call it work, but and that somebody could just sit there and say that I was lying, that I was just pretending. And that, the desperate going back over, had I got the wrong Rosen, could I cross-check that and all the rest of it? And he was saying I'd made it up. And then, of course, I immediately realised that he was coming from a base in Holocaust denial, that he was saying none of it happened. In fact, I think he actually then said none of it happened, meaning all of it. We'd all made it all up. And to start off with, I wasn't able to reply to him, I think, and then I did and said, well, I said, look, all this stuff, look, I've got these bits of paper, I was groping around with what we call historical evidence, and I've been on, say, the NISCOR site, I've looked into Holocaust denial and the tiny little ambiguities that they feed off and then multiply into great so-called truths. You know, I'd read David Cesarani, I'd read, you know, all these things, and so I was and I suddenly felt impelled to put it down on paper in a way that that young man could read. And so that I imagined him as I was writing and saying, well, look, that's what you think, but now go over this and follow my trek. So that's partly why I made the quest part of the story. I could have just said, this is what happened to my family, but I wanted to show that this is how I found out, and that there are these records and where it is and why it is and why we haven't made this stuff up. So that was a powerful moment for me to want to write this stuff. In a way, it's dedicated to him.
It's in the book as well. And I'm sorry, we're focusing mostly on the missing and not on the Move, the Book of Poetry. I feel like that's all. We could do a whole other conversation about poetry as well. And it is worth saying that you intersperse the sort of narrative elements of the book with some of your poetry as well, which I think works incredibly effectively. It's sort of impossible, particularly given the audience that you're writing for, to not give them a bit of context and history as well. So you're not just talking about your family story and about your quest to find it, but you have to sort of explain about the Holocaust. And I mean, I'm not sure if you had a target age in mind for your readers, but this strikes me as sort of, upper primary, would you say? And I feel a little bit weird reading your words to you, but I have it bookmarked here. Just here's a passage where you are explaining a bit of the Holocaust. Eventually there were laws that prevented Jewish people from having jobs and owning property. And then later during the war, there were laws to take Jewish people from their homes and to force them to live in open-air prisons, which some people called ghettos. This was all leading towards what the Nazis called the final solution of the Jewish question, in quotes, which they hoped would be the genocide of all the Jews of Europe. Genocide is the killing or attempted killing of a whole group of people. Today, this genocide is often called the Holocaust. Now that's very good. I feel like that is a very good two-paragraph summation of a lot of history. But do you feel like are there pitfalls? Were you very conscious of the sort of dangers, as you said, of getting it just right, not because of just historical accuracy for its own sake, but given the audience as well? There's so much that you're trying to balance there in terms of accuracy and appropriateness, not explaining too much that's horrific for the age group, and yet not sugarcoating it. Tell me about your thinking behind that.
Yes, well, I did an MA in children's literature, and one of my essays that I did, one of my assignments, was to look at children's books about the Holocaust. And I was horrified that some of them had actually got things factually wrong. So there was one, which shall be nameless, that described Bergen-Belsen as an extermination camp. And I thought, well, it's those kinds of little tiny errors in one respect, but it's precisely this that the deniers work on. They get their lever in and go, well, it wasn't an extermination camp. Jews weren't exterminated. They died. They were killed effectively, of course, but it wasn't technically an and I found myself engaging with some of this stuff, very aware of the kind of stuff that Irving and others had written. I mean, it dates me, but that's where I was at, if you like. And so when I sat down to write mine, I wanted it to be 100% accurate. So I went to Helen Weinstein, professor, and also to the UCL, University College London people, to check everything, to rephrase things, to make sure that it was expressed in exactly the most accurate, up-to-date way. And then insofar as their sentences might have been a bit too long, then I'd chop it up. Academics tend to have a lot of what called subordinate clauses, and if you break that up a bit with a few its and thises, it makes it a bit more accessible to young people. So I wanted to do that, and not to pull any punches, because I'd seen one or two children's books that sort of made out that it was a bit tough in the camps. I mean, again, I'm not going to name names, and I thought, well, that's wrong. Either you don't talk about it, or if you talk about it, you say what it was. You say that these were places that were scientific industrial slaughter. And you say that, and it's horrific and unbelievable, and beyond the ken of most children today, though of course we have children in schools who've come from Burundi, who've come from places where terrible slaughters have happened, from Srebrenica, from the Balkans. Not the same as the Holocaust, but I'm saying they might have ways of understanding it that might be more profound than me who hasn't understood it personally. But even so, I wanted it to be, as you say, accurate and not to pull punches. So I was very much motivated by the fact that I'd seen some children's books that kind of hadn't said it. I mean, these days, there's the boy in striped pajamas, which we know is, it's got a lot of problems. I'm not going to say it's a great film or book or anything, but, it doesn't pull punches in that sense. And of course, Schindler's List, which young people see, and other things. So in a sense, I'm not alone in this business of saying, look, this is actually what happened.
Yeah, and it is worth saying in the book at the end there's a whole section of sort of for further reading, whether about fiction, nonfiction, personal testimony. I was pleased to see that the boy in the striped pajamas was not mentioned in that.
That's thanks to UCL. UCL, I think, have produced a document for those of you interested who feel that you quite like the boy in striped pajamas. Those of you who can't stand it, University College have produced a very good document on it. I mean, it's an important thing to debate because it's a very popular film in some senses, and it is being used in schools. So there is a debate to be had about that and whether that should be discussed. So
your friend and mine, David Cesarani, wrote very well. There was a particular article that he wrote about that, which it sort of picks apart all that. And having taught, it is worth saying, as you say, that book exists in the world. Many children will have read it or seen the film. There are countless class sets of it out there in existence. You can't pretend that it's not there. So there are ways, I think, of using it in a sort of subversive way where it's like you almost use that as the springboard to launch into a historical inquiry of what's wrong with it almost. Anyway, I don't know if this is appropriate task, but there is a bit of a sort of a cliffhanger of sorts in the book in terms of what you had yet to discover. And I know there is some elements of the family story that you hadn't touched on yet. I'm just curious to know, since you finished the book and it's been published, have you learned anything more, or does the quest continue, and if so, how?
The quest does continue, absolutely. I haven't mentioned the other brother, Martin. Very briefly, I can tell you that he was also a refugee in Western France, and not far from where the other brother was, but I can't find any evidence they were in touch with each other. And he was in a very little village called Saint-Hermine in the département of Vendée. If you know your map of France and you've got that bit sticking out of Brittany, the armpit as some people call it, Saint-Hermine is there with La Rochelle, and that's where he was. And then one night the French police turned up at a door where he was with his kind of brother-in-law, and he was in a house, at the house of a woman called Madame Baubière. And at 2:30 in the morning, on instruction that had come from the Sicherheitspolizei in Poitiers, that's the security police, the German security police, passed over to the French administrators, who in France are called the préfet, the prefect, and the sous-préfet, the sub-prefect. It had all gone on a chain of command down that all Jews, not the foreign-born Jews, there was a deal between Vichy and the Nazis that only, in big inverted commas, foreign-born Jews would be deported. But here went an instruction out from the Sicherheitspolizei on the grounds that Jews were engaged in sabotage, that they would all be arrested, all the Jews of Western France. And somebody or other must have shot Martin, I don't know who or how, and as I say, the Gendarmerie Nationale knocked on his door. I have it here actually, the police report, very coldly described that they knocked on the door and picked up this man called Michael Rosen, handed him over to the Nazis. They don't say that bit. I know that they did. He was again, like Oscar just a few weeks earlier, taken to Drancy, which was the big transit camp where all Jews were taken, nearly all Jews were taken, and then shipped to Paris Bobigny station, and then to Auschwitz on this terrible 3-day journey where people were packed into cattle trucks, 1,500 in a train, and he was shipped out on Convoy 68. just a couple of months later than Oscar and Rachel. And so there were question marks about that, and I got in touch with the village and said, do you know anything about this? It was a bit bold and perhaps a bit dangerous to do, I don't know, in its own way. France has great, obviously, difficulties coping with all this. As was pointed out to me by the UCL people, that the Holocaust wasn't possible without collaboration. That if we see it purely as a German thing, we don't understand the Holocaust. That it could only have been carried out with the collaboration of other regimes, other peoples, so it's not purely a German versus Jewish thing. So I thought that was very important. The UCL pointed that out to me. I mean, I knew it but didn't know it, if you see what I mean. And so the collaboration of Vichy in this death act of arresting French Jews and our father's uncle was naturalised French. In fact, he'd fought in the French army, he'd fought in the Foreign Legion. Whereas actually Oscar had fought on the other side in the First World War. They fought on opposite sides in the First World War. Incroyable. And so I've been in touch with the mayor of Saint-Hermine, and he has been very moved by this story. And he's a history teacher, and he's taken his history students to Paris with my book in hand to show them the wall of names, to show them Martin's name also on the wall, and the fact that he was deported. And he has announced this year that he's going to name the local park in the village of Saint-Hermine after Martin Rosen. It will be known henceforth as Le Parc Martin Rosen, and on the 8th of May, this year is the inauguration, his name will be engraved on the war memorial in the village, which is a very interesting thing, because war memorials in France, as you might imagine, are very important. They usually have on the war memorial mort pour la patrie, meaning dead for the fatherland, died for the fatherland, I should say, sorry, bad translation, died for the fatherland. And you know, there's an issue as to whether deportees, Jewish or otherwise, because Spanish people, various others were deported, whether they died for the fatherland. You know, people debate this sort of thing, so it's quite a profound thing for his name to be up on that war memorial in the village. There will be a ceremony, and I've told the wider family, the Mishpucha, and I think we're all going out there, and we'll be there on the day for what I think will be an extraordinary event.
Amazing. We could go on forever, but I would like to open this up to questions, both here in the room and then possibly even some from Zoom as well. Let's see, do we have someone, a roving microphone there? And I see, we'll start here in the room, and I see a hand at the back.
I don't want to be rude. Is that Mr. Cesarani's son?
Let's see. Just, there we go.
The story and your careful retelling of history is very moving. Some of us from London has joined the walk that took place from Saint-Martin-Vesubie in the Macon tour over the mountains to into Italy, where for the last 12 years or so there's been a gathering around about to commemorate the escape of as many Jews as could get over the mountains in September 1943. It's worth talking about and worth including in the history for those who've got time. Thank you for your dignity with which you've spoken.
It's very common.
Thank you, and thank you very much. And there is a short film I think I saw, yes, you're nodding, yes, that's right, about those who were able to escape and then had further persecutions in Italy, you're nodding, in Italy, because of course the Nazis were in Italy, so there was a further problem that even after they'd escaped from the clutches of, I didn't mention him by name, but the Nazi leader of the Nazis who marched into Italy, insofar as one can grade Nazis as being worse than others, Alois Brunner was the most bestial, the most disgusting of them, who physically laid hands on people, strangling them and so on, and who escaped prosecution and survived in Syria, probably trained the Syrians in torture, and survived in Syria till relatively recently, died in his 90s. So Alois Brunner was the person directly involved with the deaths of my relatives.
Thank you. Deborah, were there some questions you wanted to read from Zoom? Or Zoom audience?
Yes. Can you hear me through this? Yes. Hello, Michael. Hi, I'm here.
Hello, Deborah. Hello.
Hi. Nice to see you. So first of all, I want to say from myself, my mother was born in Metz, and my mother's sister and brother were sent to Auschwitz by Aloy Brunner as well. And so much of what you've said resonates very much with me as well. So
Because I did find out that Martin Rosen lived in Metz. So
yeah, I know you mentioned Metz. I wrote it down.
Yeah, so
yeah.
we are fellow.
We
I've
are.
forgotten the French adjective for Metz.
Alsatians.
Yes. Alsatian.
So, Michael, first of all, somebody on Zoom would like to ask you how you are, because you were very, very ill with COVID last year. So we'd like to acknowledge that, and we're very pleased to see that you've made looks like a very good recovery. How are you feeling?
It was my organism that saved me, not that. Yes, I was in a coma for 40 days. Which is an extraordinary thing to say, particularly as I've just written a poem just yesterday about 40 days, 40 nights. It's got a sort of ring about it. It rings a bell. Noah, didn't he do a thing? There was a bird that there was it Olive? Yeah, that's right, 40 days. Anyway, and going to an ordinary school, there was this guy who was in the desert for 40 days. Anyway, so yeah, I have survived. It's the wrong word to use on a day like this, but it was quite extraordinary. And of course, I did think about some of these things, particularly when I was in the rehab hospital, and there was a man opposite me, and I looked at his name, and I thought, I just wonder. And I did say at one point, just before he was about to leave before me, are you Jewish? The way people do, it's funny, you don't look anyway, are you Jewish? And he said, yeah, and he told me his background, and very similar to mine, Czech refugees, and we both stood in the cemetery in Prague with the Altmarshal. We were able to share this, and whoosh, he'd gone. So that's kind of the experience in hospitals, and anyway, I'm still in touch with him.
That's great. So another question here is, someone's asked, what school do you go to? But I think it's more, did you go to? I think it's more like, what kind of school? Did you go to a Jewish school? I think
right.
Is what. And besides learning Jewish words, English words for Yiddish words, how did you relate to the school generally, educationally and culturally? And what bearing did it have on you as an adult?
Right, that's a big one. My parents were teachers, so I was quite familiar with education. Just think about that. Both your parents are teachers. You're at school all day, you come home, and it carries on. It did. They were very pedagogic, my parents, in every aspect of it. In fact, my mum used to describe, when my dad went like that, which he often did, she'd say, that's the pedagogic digit, Michael. Anyway, so I went to ordinary state schools. I can name them. They were Tyneholm Nursery School, Pinnerwood School, West Lodge School, Harrowweald County Grammar School, and Watford Boys Grammar School. So those were the schools that I went to. Why did I go to so many schools? Because I was in the bulge, 1946. Our parents came back, when VJ Day, I think I date. I was born 9 months after the end of the war, so there was a lot of celebration went on, and so we were the bulge, and so they opened new schools, that was one thing, and then we moved, and so I went to 4 schools, really, Tyneholm Nursery School, leaving to outside. I related to them. Well, it is quite interesting that at Harrowweald there were quite a few Jewish kids. I went to Jewish assemblies. We had a Jewish assembly. I fear that it was not totally for religious reasons, but that I was quite keen at the time. Anyway, never mind, I won't go there. I think you can fill in the gaps. Someone of the opposite sex, anyway. But anyway, it's just meant as a joke, sorry, bad taste. But when I went to Watford, there were no Jewish kids, and it was the first time I met head-on anti-Semitic jokes. And it was the first time. I knew them from my dad, because my dad had told me about things that people say. He'd once come back from where he was a teacher trainer, and a guy had been sitting next to him, a fellow academic, who had described someone as a nasty little Jew. And I said to my dad, "What did you say?" And he said, well, I said to him, "Do you know any other kind of little Jews?" And I remember thinking my dad was very clever like that, and I thought, I wish I could be so quick. And I don't believe it was what's called esprit d'escalier, where you wish you had said it, but that he was able to do that. And I remember thinking, wow. And then when I went to school, I got somebody saying, they threw some money on the floor in the sixth form common room. And then the other guy said, "You better not do that, you'll only go and pick it up." And I remember thinking, why were they laughing? I didn't even know the framework for it. And then I went home and told my parents. I said, "Well, that's an anti-Semitic joke, isn't it? It's about money." And I said, "But if you pick it up and then you give it back to them." No, you don't get it, Michael. No, it's about money and Jews. Anyway, and I got quite a bit of that. And so that was something I had to negotiate, which my parents helped me negotiate.
But I mean, this whole topic is fascinating. What I was sort of touching on earlier and thinking we might have more time for. I don't think we do, but about just, trying to unpick, which parts of your identity, whether it's, your political identity, your, intellectual, sort of direction, your Jewish identity came sort of from just that ether versus the things that you specifically learned or set out to learn. Maybe a conversation, for the coffee break or something. Or maybe, I think the reason I'm raising is I feel like there's so many different examples amongst people of the next generations, as we're calling them, where it's just sort of like we're all trying to unpick to what extent is our core identity, a product of this thing that is in our collective past. Do we have time for one more?
I just say very quickly to that. On the one hand, we don't want to be defined by the Holocaust. We don't want to say, "I'm a Jew because of the Holocaust," but at the same time we want to say that's part of what is to be Jewish, to be a European Jew. To be a European Jew is to have relatives, to sense, as I do, that in my case, that Poland has been ripped away from me. I quite have a very working in schools and hearing kids say, I went back down to Jamaica. And the sense of a sort of another home and another place that they feel that they're part of. And this idea that, well, there was this huge, vibrant Jewish culture in Poland that my relatives were part of. Some had left, some hadn't, for whatever reasons. But it was only the Americans who survived. It was only Max and Morris in America, that all the rest, the French and the Poles, that's lost. And I sort of get a sense but then you fight it at the same time and say, I don't want to be defined negatively. It's analogous to people of colour, people of African and Caribbean origin saying, I don't want to be defined by slavery, but I don't want to deny that it happened. And I can sense a sort of analogy there. And also you want to unpick that, what was European Jewishness? What was it? I remember watching Isaac Bashevis Singer accepting the Nobel Prize. And he said, people ask me, they say, why do you write in Yiddish? And he said, so I can talk to my relatives when I die. Anyway, never mind. I thought it was just incredible. And I sort of have the same sense, but I'll be dead. No, never mind.
Yeah, very, very well articulated. Do we have time for one more question here in the room, Deborah? Is there a mic? Okay, I see a microphone and a hand, helpfully very close to each other.
Thank you. Can I take you back to the school kid in Newham who asked that question that moved you so much? What do you think, was he some far-right skinhead, or what drove that person to say that in that way? If you could take a guess at his background or ideology.
Well, Holocaust denial circulates, and it is of itself, but it's also part of wider conspiracy theories. And we know in this time that conspiracy theories are flourishing one way or another, so some of it is fed by the ancient myths of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, by Mein Kampf, and people leap on this as explanations sometimes for their own hardship or their own personal dissatisfactions? I mean, it's hard to say. Why did immediately after the Twin Towers, did people say it was something more than it was and suddenly look for conspiracy theories? Why did Trump feed into conspiracy theories? Why is there, I mean, I won't name names, but of outfits in various places that, you know, create lunatic conspiracy theories to do with lizards and goodness knows what. I mean, I can't, to be honest, I mean, I can't fully answer the question other than that, you know, a similar kind of conspiracy theory, if we unpick what it was that Hitler did, why was he a complete failure in the first putsch in 28, was it? Why was that a failure, and why was he so successful a few years later? That one of the things he was able to do was to create a conspiracy theory in the times of great hardship in Germany. So, you know, he was able to lever that, and coming back to October the 4th, 1936, it's exactly what Mosley was doing. You know, there he was ranting about rich Jews. Where did he march? Through an area where the poorest Jews lived, in the East End. I mean, the conditions that my parents and grandparents lived in, I mean, it was unbelievable. And there he was ranting on about rich Jews. You go, what? My dad was living in a house 2 up, 2 down, with 12 people living in it. They were all sort of sleeping in kind of, you know, in the passage, you know, I've seen the houses there in Nelson Street behind the hospital. You know, so these conspiracy theories, it's another whole subject, but I can't say where he came from, other than that, you know, for a short period. I mean, I can see Anthony here in the room, Anthony Lishak, who does an enormous amount of Holocaust education and so on in schools. Maybe you've met, Anthony, people who just, you know, I know you're working with younger children, but might say, are you making all this up, sir? You know, that maybe you hear these things. You know, people have said that the genocides in our own lifetime have been made up and have been used for political purposes and so on. So it's very dangerous territory, isn't it? And on the one hand, I believe fundamentally that if we do the meticulous kind of work that David Cesarani has done and people like that, that these are the answers. So that's why I've said, look, these people aren't making all this stuff up. I mean, I'll be able to show you if you're interested, the Gendarmerie Nationale document. I brought it along today, where they've actually arrested my father's uncle. It's named him. Why have they arrested him? Well, I've also got the Sicherheitspolizei decree demanding that he be arrested. That's not in my imagination, but you know, that's I believe in facts, but that's not an answer to your question, so I'm very sorry.
It was compelling nonetheless. Though anti-Semitism might not be the most uplifting note on which to conclude, I do feel that actually bringing it right up to date is very appropriate, that, you know, reminding us all of the contemporary resonance and relevance of the issue, that this is something that very much you know, persists, and it's for all of us to grapple with in all sorts of different ways. So I think that is a good place to wrap up. Please join me in thanking Michael Rosen. It is